So in the chat, people are typing in where they're joining us from today. And we have folks in Dublin, Westmeath, and beautiful Wexford. But I think our committee member, Amy, wins the award for joining us from Tokyo, Japan.
There's actually a number of stakeholders actually from this research actually in the call. So hi to everybody.
Wonderful.
Yes, 3 or 4 of them at least.
Brilliant. Now we've got Kildare and Cork and Maynooth. Welcome everybody. So I'm just waiting for Susan's green light and then we'll get going.
Yeah, we're streaming on Facebook and the recording has started, so we're good.
Great, welcome. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Women in Research Ireland's December online event. I'm Dr. Cathy Corcoran, committee member and treasurer with Women in Research Ireland, or WIRI for short. I would like to take a moment to introduce the directors and founding members of WIRI attending today's event. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Feddix, co-director and co-founder of WIRI. Susan. And also Dr. Joanne Kenny, co-director.
Hi, everyone.
Now, Women in Research Ireland was founded in 2017 and is a volunteer-run charity based in Dublin, Ireland, and a group member of the National Women's Council of Ireland. WIRI's mission is to unite and build an empowering, diverse and inclusive community of underrepresented groups where silenced voices are heard in academic spaces. WIRI provides a platform for women and members of underrepresented groups working in research and academia in Ireland. Monthly events afford the opportunity to gather and discuss solutions to problems that affect our network. Since March this year, we switched our events online. Please mark your calendars for our next talk by Vanessa Lacey, Health and Education Manager with TENI, the Transgender Equality Network of Ireland. Tracademia, the experiences of trans people in academia, the joy and the pain. Vanessa will be joining us on Friday, January 15th at 1 p.m. and details about that event will be shared in the new year. In addition, WIRI received a grant from the Royal Society of Chemistry Inclusion and Diversity Fund to hold a workshop series called Addressing Mental Health, a Proactive Approach for Researchers, coming in the new year. You can learn more about WIRI on our website at womeninresearch.ie and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Now for today's event. We're delighted to welcome Claire McGing today. Claire is Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager at IADT Dunleary and is a gender and politics researcher. Claire is a member of the senior management team at IADT, leading on equality, diversity and inclusion, Athena Swan and the framework for consent in HEIs. She has published research widely on gender politics and Irish politics, including chapters in the 2011, 2016 and 2020 editions of How Ireland Voted, Palgarve Macmillan, and a number of reports on women's representation in Irish local government for the National Women's Council of Ireland, funded by the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government. Forthcoming publications include Women's Representation in Dáil Éireann in Revolutionary and Post-Revolutionary Ireland, in Linda Connolly, editor, Women and the Irish Revolution from Irish Academic Press, Dublin, and a special issue of Irish Political Studies on Gender and Politics on the Island of Ireland, co-edited with Lisa Keenan, TCD, and Maria Adriana Diana, QUB. Claire is also a regular contributor to Irish media on gender politics and Irish elections. The title of Claire's presentation today is Doing Politics in a Different Way, the Establishment of Caucuses for Women Councillors in Irish Local Government. We encourage you to live tweet this event on social media by using the hashtags #WIRI, W-I-R-I, and #WomenInLocalPolitics or #MoreWomen. Lastly, today's event is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. Please keep your microphones on mute during the presentation. If you have any questions for Claire, please type them into the chat and we will share them at the end of the presentation. Welcome, Claire.
Okay, thank you very much. You can hear me okay, I assume?
Yep.
Just share my screen, and I'm doing this now since March. And does it make anyone else nervous still? Can you see my screen at the moment? Yeah?
Yes.
Great. Let me just see. I'll just admit somebody there. For a second. Slideshow. Okay, so thank you very much to the committee for the invitation to present this research, and it's research I have been quite immersed in for quite some time, but it became particularly, I suppose, alive for me over the summer as a result of a particular research project that I was involved with. And I suppose all of my academic research up to this point has looked at the issue of gender representation in politics, or what I call the gender problem in politics. That problem being the chronic and systemic underrepresentation of women in all levels in electoral decision making. So what I'm going to do, I suppose, over the next 40 minutes or so is I'm going to give you a bit of context to this gender problem. I'm going to look at some statistics from the Dáil level and also in local government, which is the focus of this talk. I'm going to give you a little bit of theory, a little bit of the literature on why gender matters in Irish politics. I will look at caucuses in politics and introduce what a caucus is in politics, the function of what they do, the type of caucuses that exist. And I suppose look in particular at why Irish local government may be, and in some cases is emerging as an area where caucuses for women can develop and can succeed. I'm then going to just talk you through some of the data collation methods. So I suppose that really are informing my thinking. And really then, I suppose I will look at a couple of caucuses that have already been established in Ireland. I'll introduce you to the Oireachtas Women's Caucus, which I was involved with establishing, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A if people are interested. But also 2 caucuses or committees for women councillors that currently exist. One is in Limerick and the other is in Dublin City. And just on that point, I can see through the participants that there are a number of women councillors in this seminar at the moment, and a number of those have spoken to me and have contributed to this research. And I just want to thank them for that and to their input. So Irish politics has a gender problem. And there is systemic or chronic underrepresentation of women throughout the Irish political system. So as you can see here, what I've done is I have graphed the percentage of women TDs in all general elections since 1977. So I've gone back quite a bit. 1977 is seen as the election where women's representation in the Dáil started to kind of kick off from a very, very low base prior to that. And for a variety of, I suppose, historical and socio-cultural reasons, the proportion of women TDs in Irish political life has been quite low. So in 1992, as a result of Mary Robinson's election 2 years previous to that, parties did start to make more of an effort to try and attract and recruit women candidates. But nonetheless, the record high achieved at that time was only 12%. And in actual fact, it stayed that way until the 2011 general election, which is considered, for those of you who remember it, considered to be the real earthquake election of its time, though we couldn't have predicted what would happen in 2020. But it wasn't an earthquake for women, where only 15% women TDs were elected. Things started to change in 2016 as a result of gender quota legislation that was implemented by the Fine Gael Labour Party coalition in 2012. And that gender quota legislation targets candidate selection for the Dáil. So essentially, candidates have to run at least 30% women and at least 30% men. And that point is important. It is a gender neutral quota in its design, or they will lose 50% of the funding they receive annually from the Exchequer. And that funding is to run their operations. So it's to employ their staff, it's to do their research, and it's the day-to-day things that parties need to do to survive, like any organisation. In 2016, as a result of that legislation, we saw women's candidacy increase from just 20% in the previous general election to from 15%, should I say, in the previous general election to 30% in the 2016 general election. So a 90% increase in the proportion of women candidates contesting for seats in that time. And that did see an increase in the proportion of women holding seats. So it went up to 22%, though still from a very low base. In the most recent general election, quotas again had quite a big impact on candidate selection. So again, 31% of candidates were women, but it didn't have as much of an impact on party seat winning. So where just 23% of women were elected. That is a numerical increase of just one woman. And there's a number of reasons for that really aren't the focus of this talk, but I can kind of talk to it in the Q&A. But just as kind of an overhead, I suppose, as you will remember, it was a particularly bad election for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, despite the fact that they did end up going into coalition with the Green Party. And what seems to have happened is that women incumbent TDs in particular were disproportionately impacted by that vote swing. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that, but that is largely what happened. Sinn Féin women, though, as you may know, did very, very well in that election and is largely driving that figure. National politics is, of course, a hugely important area for women to be represented on equal terms. It's also, as we know, the pool from which cabinet ministers are recruited, are appointed, and thus it's really important that we look and that the state looks to address this. At the current rate of progress, it will take 43 years for women to reach parity in Dáil Éireann with men, 43 years. And we're currently 92nd in the world rankings for women's representation in our lower house. And we share that distinction with the Czech Republic and Panama. There are also issues with local government level, and in general, we have tended to see the proportion of women at local office often mirrors that of national office. Women currently account for 25% of local councillors as a result of a number of co-options that have happened since the last general election, 2019. And actually a majority of those co-options have been women councillors. So 24% women elected in the local elections last year. And as you can see from that graph, it has been increasing, but nonetheless, change has been slow. And we are below the EU average for women's representation in local and municipal government, which currently sits at 32%. Global data tends to be patchier on this, so we don't have any rankings, unfortunately, as to where we sit. But it would be fairly similar to the national picture, I would imagine. I suppose one or 2 points just to say here is that, like the Dáil, the issue with women councillors largely relates to the fact that they're not being recruited in adequate numbers as candidates. And there's a number of reasons for that. But the gender quota legislation that looks at Dáil elections is not in place for local elections, and that is because the party funding is linked on what percentage of the vote a party gets at Dáil electoral level, and thus there is no kind of obvious sanction to tie parties to it, and that is the problem. And we also see, and I'm going to show you another table in a second, we also see particular issues at rural level where women are very, very underrepresented both as candidates and as elected councillors in different local authority areas. And the marginalisation of women's voices at local level impacts on our representative democracy because with its proximity to women's lives, local government is uniquely situated to strengthen women's leadership and participation and to improve their representation of their interests. And that is, of course, the idea behind a caucus, and I'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes. And research does show that there is a link between the proportion of women politicians and the output of that assembly, though there are some constraints on women in acting in gendered or feminist ways. Very, very importantly too, and linking to my previous graph, local government is a key pipeline for national office and is actually statistically more significant for women in the Dáil than it is for men. So the vast, vast majority of successful TDs have started out their career in local office. And I'd say to anybody who wants to become a TD, run for your council and get elected and build your base there. It's more challenging to come without. Now it does happen, of course, but it's not overly common, and it builds up voter recognition, etc. So I suppose it's a two-pronged issue. Local government, for its own sake and in its own right, should be representative of the communities in which it represents. But as well as that, the underrepresentation of women in local office is also impacting on pipeline to national office. And there's a very real possibility in the next decade that the proportion of women councillors will fall relative to the number of women TDs in Leinster House. The programme for government of the most recent coalition does highlight the need for greater diversity and greater equality in local government. And the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government has a responsibility under the National Strategy for Women and Girls to achieve this. As of yet, though, there have been few targeted measures to try and address these issues. And as I said, without these, it is quite concerning going forward. Now, there has been some work ongoing. For example, they do have a fund that councils can apply for to try and put in place their own local initiatives, etc. So there is some work happening, but I would argue not fast enough. And I also just want to show you the urban-rural divide. There is significant differences across the different local authority areas in women's representation at local council level. And that runs from one woman on Offaly County Council to Dublin City Council and Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown Council, where parity has been almost reached. And I'll let you kind of see your own council there and just see where your own council stands. But that, as you can imagine, creates real difficulties in terms of trying to set up a caucus at local authority level. And secondly, I suppose the experiences of these women working or being quite isolated in their councils and may have implications for how they for their lived experience of public office. And I think probably further research in that area is required. I don't want to bore you on the structure of local government, but just to say that there are 31 local authority areas, and each local government area has a council. Councillors themselves have a number of roles. Local government in Ireland is highly centralised because of the dependence on the exchequer, and local government has also progressively lost its control of a number of services to national and regional bodies over the years, for example, in the areas of education and health and so on. They are responsible for the provision of public services and facilities like housing, planning, roads, environmental protection, fire services, maintaining the electoral register, etc. And elected councillors do play a role in supporting economic development and enterprise at local level. And councillors have both a legislative and a policy role, and an advocacy and a representational role. And councillors, apart from TDs, are the only directly elected local authority representatives in the country. They also account for the biggest electorate for Seanad elections, if you take out the university, the 6 university seats as well. So they're a very, very important group of local politicians. Though it's formally a formal role, a part-time role, in reality, the vast majority of councillors are working very long hours, and it is like a full-time job. And many of them also hold second jobs alongside having kind of caring responsibilities as well, and doing a triple shift. So I think we just have to recognise the strain a lot of councillors are on as a result of all of these different issues. So why does this matter? Well, I won't get into too much jargon with you, but I just want to give you, I suppose, a couple of key concepts that will frame the rest of this discussion. And when we talk about, in the literature, when we talk about women's representation in politics, we draw, or we differentiate between what we call descriptive representation and substantive representation. Descriptive representation is women's numerical representation, or what I call the who of politics. How many women are in a political assembly, in a political party, and how does that vary, say, for example, by urban or rural divides. It says nothing about what these women do when they're in politics, just who they are, their demographic and social backgrounds. And of course, you can apply descriptive representation to any social or demographic background, not just gender, for example, race, or the representation of the traveller community in politics, or those with disabilities, etc. But it's about numbers, essentially about numbers. And a lot of the work in women in politics would focus on trying to increase the number of women holding office. But there is another branch of thought and theory, and that is called substantive representation, or what I call the what of politics. And this is essentially the impact of women's representation. What difference does it make to have women in politics and to have more women in politics? What difference does their collaboration in a caucus make, for example? And though those two types of representation are distinct, in actual fact, most scholars in this area, myself included, are quite interested in how the descriptive connects to the substantive, i.e., what is the impact of increasing women's representation in politics in terms of the output of the assembly. There's also what is called symbolic representation, and that is the idea that women have a role model effect in politics, that when women run for politics or are seen in politics, that they encourage other women to run, and that they also ensure that women feel more represented by seeing people like them there. And again, you could use that same analogy for all other underrepresented groups in politics. And there is a lot of empirical research actually showing that women do play a role model effect as politicians. Now, to go back to the descriptive and substantive piece, there is no guarantees that women in politics will change the outputs. Now, the literature does show that in general, there are improved outcomes for the policy process where descriptive representation is improved. And certainly there would have been for many years a concept called critical mass, this idea that if you got 30% women into office, that things would start to change. However, there is now increasing recognition in the field that the relationship between the descriptive and the descriptive and the substantive elements of representation is, to quote one scholar in this field, probabilistic rather than deterministic. And a number of academics have written about how we can't assume that all women in politics are going to bring with them a gendered analysis. We can't assume they're all feminists. And we know that there are multiple interpretations on feminism anyway. So to say my second quote there, to quote Sarah Childs, it's very important that we don't align the substantive representation of women by women with the feminist representation of women by feminist women. In my own work, I have also considered this, and I have looked at how we need to consider how women politicians, even if they want to make a difference, will often enter into institutions that are male gendered and that may constrain their ability to act for women, whether or not that's in a feminist way. So as I have argued, the ability of gendered political actors to make a substantive impact on policy for women has to be considered, as they may be limited by their party affiliation and ideology, how long they have served in Parliament, and whether or not they hold positions of power. So I suppose just to kind of summarize all this theory, yes, women in general do seem to bring a difference to politics, and that is what we should be striving for. But we should never forget that women politicians work in particular contexts that may constrain or may provide opportunities for them to act for women. And that is where women's caucuses become a particularly interesting tool for considering how women can make a difference in politics, but also considering how women politicians may, in the face of institutional difficulty, may come together formally to try and increase their influence within political assemblies. And there are many ways that women politicians can collaborate. It's not always through a caucus. But caucuses are committees or groups that have been created within political assemblies in many countries to strengthen the cooperation between women in political life. And they may have multiple purposes. But what's really, really important about a caucus is that they're not tied to their political party. So democracy, as we usually know it, is based on a system of competition between political parties. A caucus is different. In a caucus, women are, I suppose, negotiating their party identity with their gender identity and trying to find common ground and to come together to increase their influence and to advance change for women. Caucuses may be formal, informal, or a hybrid of these two models. And I'm going to talk you through in Ireland a couple of examples of how that can operate. A formal caucus would essentially be a formal committee of a parliament or a local authority. An informal caucus would be one that, though has women councillors or politicians as their members, does not actually have a formal link to the council. And some can take a hybrid of those two models. So for example, a council may recognise a caucus or a committee, but it's not actually a formal committee in practice. And again, to go back to what I said a couple of minutes ago about the institutions of politics, I am a feminist institutionalist, so all of my work is thinking through how formal and informal norms and rules both constrain or create opportunities for change to happen. And I suppose it's important to note that the structure and priorities and effectiveness of a caucus will be dependent on the local and political environment in which it operates and the needs that women representatives identify for themselves. Or to put that, I suppose, in a more simplified way, you can't assume that a caucus that works in one local authority or parliament will work in the other in the same way. And that's why women will choose to go with different types of caucus models. There is a growing body of literature concerned with caucuses in parliaments or legislative caucuses, but we do have a lot of gaps in our knowledge about local government contexts where party affiliation may matter less, and which are, as I have said, and which my colleague, Dr. Pauline Cullinan-Maynooth has argued in her work, are closer to the proximity of women's lives. Just to say that in the Irish context, although most councillors are members of political parties, party allegiances are less important or less strict on local councillors compared to the way in which they are in the national parliament in terms of the more day-to-day decisions and operations of the council. And parties on local authorities do not tend to organise themselves into kind of alternative policy groups in the context of decisions to be made on reserve functions to be taken by councillors. In some cases that they will, but it's not as partisan an environment as the Dáil or even the Seanad would be. And members regularly work together on cross-party lines to progress local issues on municipal, district and area committees. Another thing just to say, and that may help in progressing caucuses at local authority level, is that there are a very high number of independent members in local authorities. So independents account for 1/5 of councillors at the moment, and that includes 35 women councillors. So all of these factors may help for local government in Ireland. Just to say that in terms of my data collation for what I'm about to look at, my approach to research, I take a feminist, epistemological and methodological approach, and I'm gender sensitive. And what I mean by that is that I recognize my own positionality and my own lived experience in the research. And I have been quite fortunate, because I've been working in this area for a long time, to have developed relationships with different stakeholder groups and with number of women politicians. And I have managed to get access that some other researchers may not have had. And I just want to recognize that as a methodological principle in the research. So just to say that I have participated in participation observation research with the Irish Women's Parliamentary Caucus. I helped to establish that with now Minister Catherine Martin. And I kind of acted as an informal advisor to that group for their first couple of years. And I also have had participant observation with the Dublin City Women's Committee, and I spoke to them actually their first kind of couple of sessions they had with their councillors about looking at what a caucus might look like, or committee for them. And I was also present the day that they brought in a facilitator to try and kind of hammer down their aims and objectives. A number of other pieces of research I've been involved with were conducted for a piece of work I did for the National Women's Council of Ireland, and I think Catherine is on this call. Because that work was done for the NWCI, I'm not going to release or discuss that data today, but just to say that there will be there will be something published on this, I believe, in the near future. So there's kind of additional research here that I'm drawing on, but I'm not going to directly reference. And I also want to reference previous research I conducted with Dr. Pauline Cullen in Maynooth, which really, I suppose kind of shaped and structured my thinking in this general area and the needs for women councillors. So just to give you, let you know that the Women's Parliamentary Caucus was established by current and former Women Oireachtas members in 2017. And it is a cross-party forum for Irish women TDs and senators to discuss and campaign on issues predominantly affecting women. All former and current members, women members of both houses, are automatically members of that caucus unless they choose not to be. So they have to opt out, essentially. And the National Women's Council of Ireland act as secretariat to the Women's Caucus. So it is technically an informal type of committee. It's not a formalised committee of the houses of the Oireachtas. Nonetheless, they do meet in the Oireachtas, or they did prior to COVID. And the Oireachtas would have supported the caucus in a number of ways, but it's not a formal committee of caucus of the Parliament. And that would follow the model with other all-party groups, where secretariat is provided for by a relevant interest group. The caucus had a number of achievements during the lifetime of the 32nd Dáil. For example, they passed an all-party motion on period poverty. They managed to get a dignity and respect survey launched for all staff in Leinster House. And they held a meeting in 2018 where they invited women caucuses from across the world to come and to meet in Dublin Castle. I was very lucky to be present at it and to try, I suppose, and enhance women's global collaboration as parliamentarians. And I'm aware that the caucus met again last month following the 2020 general election. I think COVID probably caused them a couple of issues, but I'm not aware of what happened at that, but I do know that they did meet. And I suppose just to say that, so there are two caucuses that have been established in different ways on the back of what has been done in Leinster House and other work. So based on the Oireachtas Women's Caucus, the Limerick Women's Caucus was established into September 2019. The 9 women councillors are all members of the caucus, and all bar 2 of those were newly elected in 2019. And I know from speaking, and I have a couple of quotes here for you in a minute, but I know from speaking to those women that they have found this a very beneficial supportive structure for them as new councillors. And like the Dáil Caucus or the Oireachtas Caucus, the Limerick Women's Network provides the secretariat to this group on a voluntary basis. It's not a council committee, but it was officially recognised in a motion to the whole council in early 2020, and that was significant. The group provides each other with supports and they build awareness. And they are at the moment, or certainly when I spoke to them a couple of months ago, they were trying to find their feet and develop a constitution and develop a structure and an aim, etc. But they have worked to raise local awareness of gender equality issues, including the impacts of COVID-19 on women in the workplace, and working to end violence against women. And there are a number of challenges and opportunities this type of caucus that I'll just briefly mention when I'm concluding. And I just have two quotes there from two women members of that caucus. So one says, for example, "We have made really good connections with each other. The first day was like a big counselling session. To be honest, I think there was more crying done than anything else." Can see that I have a warning, so that's okay, thank you. I think there was more crying done than you'd see at a funeral. We were all exhausted from the election campaign and we were delighted to be given the privilege of being councillors. And they said it was lovely to be in a room with like-minded people and to just have a chat. And they finished with saying that men have that connection anyway because they're in sport or they're in politics or they're in a job. Another member said, "I think there is a huge value in the 9 female councillors being together and working together on issues that are apolitical or non-political, however you want to describe it." And she felt it sent a message about women's politics and, you know, kind of speaks to the symbolic representation aspect. So, Dublin City Women's Council have also established a group of their women councillors, and this kind of follows on from some all-women work that would have been taken in the council in previous years and decades. But that group was established, unlike the Limerick case, and this again shows that women's caucuses will operate differently depending on the needs of the women and the context in which they work. But it was established as a subcommittee of the City Council Protocol Committee in this June. Women account for 46% of members of the council. And 90% of women representatives are members of that committee, and every party is represented on it. It has a chair, Councillor Darcy Lonergan of the Green Party, and council staff act as secretariat and provide administrative support. And I'm almost certain that Councillor Lonergan is in this seminar as well. And I just want to say that she would have been the driving force behind getting this committee established. The committee has 3 areas of focus: economic issues for women and for carers, safety, so urban planning and urban design through a feminist perspective, things like making Dublin a safer city, transport, domestic violence, cycling, etc., and council work and how they can make a change or try to, I suppose, to try to have a positive impact on the way in which the council conducts itself. And that is an important agenda for them. There's also challenges and opportunities for this type of caucus too, and I'll mention that just at the end. So I just have a quote here from a member of that caucus who said that, I suppose she emphasised that what they're trying to do really is be pragmatic and try to have an influence, that because they're under time pressure, that a committee or a women's committee allows individual members to work on different tasks and that they can then come together to support those in the council. So she said, "I think Irish politics and the way that we're set up, I think that a lot of this is based on exhaustion. A lot of what I and the committee is doing is they're trying to minimise both the amount of work they have to do to make a real impact. And that's driving a lot of what we had to do. I suppose if we had a blank slate and time was no issue and we weren't exhausted, what would we do?" So that's the Dublin City Council. So 2 very different models of caucus or committee. So I just want to summarise or finish with the key learnings from the research so far. And as I say, it's kind of rapidly, it's developing in the past couple of months in particular, and there will be a number of kind of outputs from it. But I suppose just to say that framing the task at hand is key. So women have got to find common ground that works across party dynamics, but also intergenerational differences have emerged as important. You know, women of different ages may have different I suppose opinions or interpretations or ideas for how a caucus or committee should progress gender issues, and that has to be managed. And they also have to consider the institutional context and the opportunity structure. The role of entrepreneurs is key here. A caucus requires an entrepreneur to lead the process, to initiate it, to find the gaps where they can make a difference, where they can work with the rules and the norms to try and get the caucus or committee established. And that was very, very evident in all of the case studies that I looked at. Certainly in the Leinster House case, it would have been Deputy Catherine Martin. In Dublin City Council, it was Deputy Darcy Lonergan. And in Limerick, it would have been the Limerick Women's Network who would have taken on that role at the start. So they had a slightly different process where it was the women's sector who came to them and not the other way around. Issues around formality, should the council or committee be a formal committee of the council or not? That will depend on the resources available to the council and what they want to achieve. One issue was finding common ground on gender and the relationship the committee will have with feminism or being described as a feminist committee or not. That will depend sometimes on whether or not it's formal committee or not, but also the relationship with women's organisations. And I suppose if you formalise a women's caucus, there is a bit of a trade-off there. You don't probably have as much input from the women's sector as you do maybe with an informal type of caucus, but they're trade-offs caucuses will have to make. The resources to get the job done are key, whether that's financial, administrative. Of course, councillors have very few administrative resources, and that is a challenge across the board for them. You know, meeting rooms, etc. Setting boundaries is important. So these women are ultimately, even if they are in a caucus, will run against each other for election in a couple of years' time. And boundaries have to be set. And all of the committees or caucuses that I've spoken to have considered that and are kind of actively looking at how they might put in place those boundaries. I haven't gotten into it in this research, but there will be resistance from either council officials, male councillors, and in some cases, other women councillors too, for a variety of reasons. And I think that in future research, that will be picked up. And finally, I just want to say that there are real challenges for those local authorities that simply don't have enough women to establish their own caucuses. And ironically, these are the very caucuses that actually need it, or councils that need it in the first place. So there is some work ongoing around looking at whether or not it would be appropriate to establish regional caucuses. And here I just want to make reference to the See Her Elected or She initiative in the Northwest and Midlands region, which is empowering women in those areas to run for office. And I suppose to raise their confidence and their knowledge in that area. And there are 15 women councillors in that area. And though they're not a caucus at the moment, there may potentially be scope for that to maybe become a regional caucus or support structure in some way. And I also just want to say too that the Association of Irish Local Governments, I know a couple of reps are here, they have also started some work on trying to bring women councillors together at a national level. And at their most recent meeting prior to the end of the world with COVID, they did have a meeting of women councillors and to try and, I suppose, flesh out some common themes. So I've gone over probably a little bit of time, but we have about 10 minutes for questions, and you can email me if you've others. So I will leave it there, and thank you very much. Thank you so much, Claire. That was revealing in lots of positive ways, but also certainly concerning ways. As a proud Offaly woman, seeing that there's only one female councillor in the Offaly County Council is telling. And thank you so much. There's been loads of activity in the chat. I'm going to hand it over to Joanne and Anna, and they're going to ask you some questions.
Great. Hi, Claire. Thanks so much for the talk. So we'll have our Q&A session now. So for everyone out there, if you want to, you can come on yourself, just unmute yourself and ask your questions for Claire. Or if you want to chat, type them in the chat box, we'll ask them for you. So I saw we had one from Vivian Rath in the chat box earlier. Do you want to come on and ask that question, Vivian? If you're still here. I can actually see the question. Yeah.
So,
Grant,
how are you, Claire?
Hi, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't realize my camera was up. Sorry, Claire. Yeah, as you know, I'm a disabled person disability rights campaigner, and one area that has really struggled is the number of disabled people involved in political life and in politics, and they are hugely underrepresented in public and political life in Ireland. And as this event is obviously focused on women, I know that women are extremely underrepresented in political life and face a range of barriers that perhaps are not being considered and are certainly not even being considered for the wider public of disabled people. So I'm just wondering, Claire, from your perspective, how could this caucus or such organisations go about ensuring that disabled women are more engaged with the process?
Thank you very much, and I'm well aware of your work, Vivian. So lovely to finally put a voice and to say to a name. I completely agree, and I suffer with a chronic health condition myself that affects my daily life. So I'm very, very sensitive to this from both kind of a personal and from a kind of academic level. There are a number of things, I suppose, firstly, and it's not, kind of moving a little bit just from women, or from candidacy. I'm very aware that there's a number of initiatives the state has to take to try and better advance and support voters with disabilities to vote. And I am aware that there's a couple of pieces of kind of work that has been going on the past couple of years in that regard. And I believe IREC, for example, have made some recommendations on that. And that is an area where an electoral commission, if we ever get it, should be looking at. So there's a couple of things there. I totally agree with you too on candidacy. And I suppose if I had more time, I could have spoke for 8 hours, to be honest with you. If I had more time, I would have liked to have gone into, there is a specific section in this research about the concept of intersectionality. And as one stakeholder told me, a representative of a traveller women's organisation, she said to me, look, women's caucuses in politics, because their membership is predetermined, it's local elected representatives, and those women themselves are a very homogenous group. They are predominantly white, they're predominantly able-bodied, etc. And that stakeholder in particular really was emphasised the need for women's caucuses to be effective. They have got to be intersectional in their approach to how they approach gender equality and how they support and encourage other women to come forward, including women with disabilities and women from other underrepresented groups. So I think for a caucus point of view themselves, I think that there is a piece of work that can be done there. And that's why, as I said at the end, links with the women's community sector and other civic society organisations are key in that regard. And the final thing, because I might talk to you offline about this, but the final thing just to say is, I do think there is a massive onus on political parties to do more on this very issue. At the moment, I recognise a couple of parties have taken some steps here and there have been some kind of firsts, but I do think parties will have to look at their own structures internally, look at their recruitment processes, and will have to step up on this wider issue of diversity. That answered that in a not a very succinct way.
Yeah, I think that was perfect, Claire. Thank you very much. And I want to note your point that you made in relation to access to voting. I mean, at the very basic level, all citizens in the state have a right to access voting. And as you pointed out, some disabled people still face barriers, even in my own county of Wexford, in accessing the right to vote. So thanks, Claire. We'll talk again some other time.
And just to say one other thing on that, that's going to become a real issue if we have an election during the pandemic, because at the moment our rules around, as you'll know, around kind of allowing people to vote, kind of get postal votes, is actually very, very narrow. So that's going to become an issue, I think, to be honest. But anyway, we might talk about that offline.
Yeah. Hello, Claire.
Hi, Liam.
Yeah, hi, Claire. Liam Kenny here, Association of Irish Local Government. And can I first of all say that you're missed from the Maynooth environment. Maynooth's loss has been Dún Laoghair's gain, and what have you. So at least you've a view of the sea there. We're a bit land here in Maynooth. But in any event, just can I acknowledge just the presence in this discussion of our president, Councillor Mary Hode, who's making history herself and being the first female president of our organisation since it was reformed in 2014. And I know she is very committed to advancing as far as we can the visibility of women in local government. I acknowledge also the work of my colleague Tom Moylan, who is liaising with the Department of Environment and Local Government with a view to trying to move along our aspiration of some form of a national network of female councillors. Unfortunately, that has been made very much less rewarding by the arrival of COVID. While obviously one can proceed with online type forums, I think you use the expression in the flesh yourself in your conversation, and nothing beats the realistic physical meeting. And I think it's not really until COVID is behind us that we can properly address that. And also just acknowledge the input of our communications officer, Ms. Elaine Lynch, who is really working wonders in terms of the organisation's kind of profile. Just a couple of quick things, if I may mention, can give you a little update on your mention of an electoral commission if we ever get one. Yesterday, under the leadership of Councillor Hode, our president, we met with Minister Malcolm Noonan, Minister for Heritage and Electoral Reform. And we made these points about the underrepresentation of women and other minority groups. We very much got the impression that the minister was invested and committed to progressing as he could measures to redress those imbalances in the council chambers of the land. I don't think I'm giving away any state secrets when he told us at a briefing that the mammoth electoral reform bill, and it will be a mammoth bill, will be published next year, and it will contain the legislative underpinning for the Electoral Commission. So as you say quite rightly, and you've looked at many a programme for government over the past 20 years where an Electoral Commission has been identified as an aspiration, in 2021 it may move from aspirational to statutory reality. But finally, can I just round off, and I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time in your conversation. The thing that I'm hearing from female public representatives over the past number of months and so on, and the biggest difficulty they're encountering is not stuff like support services, it's not stuff like childcare and whatever. It's the negativity and abuse of social media. Yeah. As recently as last Wednesday, Holly Cairns, TD and former councillor, spoke about that on RTE. Within the past 3 or 4 weeks, Hazel Chu, Lord Mayor of Dublin, has said the same thing. And just as one tiny little pushback to this monster, which is of devouring the electronic world, can I ask people for even just one day, when they're going to use the term social media, to replace it with the term anti-social media? We have so uncritically sold our souls to the lure of the electronic empires, if you like. And just for one day, use that terminology, anti-social media, in conversation, and it might give a more realistic appreciation of what we're facing under that heading. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you for that, Liam. And look, I recognise the work that the ALG is doing on this, on the National Caucus. I'm very glad to get an update on the Electoral Commission as well. And I totally agree on social media. So for many years, we had these 5 C's that were considered to be the barrier to women in politics: childcare, cash, confidence, candidate selection and culture. And I think we have to add, we'll have to come up with a C word, but I think we'll have to add social media. And I've spoken to a number of councillors, and I've done 2 surveys of women councillors in the past 18 months. And in all of those surveys, women are coming back and back and back to say that they're dealing with this on horrendous levels of abuse. And I have to say to this group, I'm quite concerned that the proportion of women in councils may actually regress in the next election, because there are a number of women who have decided they will not run again on the back of what's happening. So I appreciate that, Liam, and I think it's a really important point.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for the questions, and also for your answers and your really insightful talk, Claire. We have time for one more question. So the next question is from Michelle Maher, and do you want to come on and ask your question yourself, Michelle? If not, I'll be happy to ask it. There you are.
Yeah. Hello, Claire. Thank you for a fabulous talk and a great presentation. My question was around rural councils and that whole question where 1 woman in Offaly and 4 in Donegal, and how do you think caucuses would work in the rural constituencies of Ireland?
I think on the back of our talk, Michelle was a stakeholder to this research as well. So it's great to see everybody. But I think so the report from the Women's Council should come out soon. But essentially what was recommended was regional caucuses to give women those types of supports. Now, another model that is considered, and it was actually the AILG who suggested this to me, was that if, for example, if a formal council, now this would require changes to how expenditure and expenses for councillors work, and I won't bore you with that, but needless to say, it's a complicated area. But that if there is, so either a regional caucus, you know, supported and funded by departmental funding or some other form of funding, or the other option was that if there is a formal committee, say, for example, Dublin City Council as an example, if there was one of those, that there may be an option for women in a neighbouring county to join that caucus on an informal level, just to get the learnings and get the support from other women, and it would require a slight change, I believe, in the expenses. So they were kind of the two we came up with. But that is the real irony, that it's the women in the councils who need the caucus that can't. They just can't, and this wouldn't be exclusive to the Irish context. There's lots of research, for example, in the United States, which would show that even at their local government level, this is often an issue, and they've had to try and improvise and try to collaborate in other ways. I also think too that a national, whether it's a national caucus or even the AILG or the LGMA, bringing women together as a group, maybe once a year, whatever, I do think there is a benefit to that, even from a lobbying point of view. So at the moment, people may not be aware that politicians in Ireland don't have any entitlement to maternity leave at all. And that is proving a real barrier to younger women in particular, you know, and women who may be thinking of having children before they run for office, or after they run for office. So that is something that a national committee or a national group of women councillors maybe could lobby on, be quite effective, you know, to see all of their names together potentially.
Thank you, and I'd also like to acknowledge the work of the AILG in this area, and especially around social media.
Great, thank you, Michelle, and thank you to everybody for attending today and for contributing your feedback and your questions. We didn't get to all of them today, but we've captured everything in the chat, and we're going to share that with Claire so that she has it moving forward. But Claire, on behalf of everyone at WIRI, I just wanted to thank you so much for your time today, for sharing your brilliant research, and looking forward to seeing where you take it next.
Thank you very much. And look, it's nice to talk about women in politics for an hour, because I don't get so much time to do it anymore. But just one or two things to say. I do see I have, there is a comment in from Councillor Lorda Scott in Wicklow. And Lorda, I might contact you separately because we had spoken about that. And I might just give a sentence. Somebody asked, is there resistance to the establishment of caucuses? There is. I didn't address it here, but I will have forthcoming research being published on this issue next year you can watch out for. But there is resistance, absolutely. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.